in this video, we're going to look at separation techniques. Now, there are a lot of different separation techniques that scientists use. They range from filtering or evaporating, distillation. If you want to get more specific, you can do things like you can use a centrifuge to separate. You can do something called chromatography, which will separate things into different components. So there are lots of different separation techniques that we can use. And separation techniques are all based on the physical and chemical properties of the substances you're trying to separate. So there's two major guidelines that we like to think about. So we need to think about what the different substances are going to do. What are their properties? So we need to think about properties. And for right now, we're going to be focusing on properties that we're already very familiar with. So whether or not something's going to dissolve or not dissolve, whether or not it's going to be able to boil, whether or not it's magnetic, things like that. The other guideline that we need to think about is that order matters. So if you're trying to separate multiple components from a mixture, the order that you do the separation techniques will depend on how all of those components are actually going to separate. So again, it's going to go back to their properties. So we need to keep in mind order. So order is important. So the first example that we're going to look at is copper in water. Okay, so if you have copper in water, the first thing we need to think about is what is that going to look like? Well, does copper dissolve in water? No, copper is going to be a solid. Okay, so we're visualizing that we have a container that has water that has little pieces of copper in it. Now, how are we going to get those two things separated? Well, the first thing we could do is we could boil the water off. Okay, so you're going to heat the water, it'll boil, it'll eventually evaporate, and you'll be left with copper behind. Now, that's great if the only thing you care about is the copper. Well, what if you cared about the water? These copper pieces are pretty big, so then we could use something called filtration. And we could filter the copper out from the water. So you'd use something similar to a coffee filter. Depending on how big the pieces of copper are, you might use a super fine coffee filter like substance or material. But that would leave us with the copper left on the filter paper, and we'd have the water separate. So when we think about our two guidelines, so we're thinking about these properties. Copper won't dissolve in water, and we need to think about the order and what we want from our separation. Both of these would work, but it depends on what the ultimate purpose is. Our second example is salt and water. Okay, so first thing, what's going to happen? If you mix salt and water, what's going to happen? Well, the salt's going to dissolve. Okay, so you're going to have this substance where it's going to look like just clear water because salt dissolves in water. So how are we going to separate them? Well, we could do the same thing that we do up here. We could boil the water off. So then we'd lose our water and we'd be left with salt behind in whatever our container is. Okay, so again, what if we wanted to keep the water? What if that was what was important? Could we filter this like we filtered the copper in water? No, the salt's going to be too small that you're not going to be able to filter out the salt from the water. Then we need a different process. So you can use something called distillation. Distillation is similar to boiling. That's actually the first part of distillation. But you're going to boil the water and then you're going to recondense it. So you're going to cool it off so it turns back into a liquid, but using an apparatus that separates that out into a different area. So you're going to distill off the water. So you'll boil the water and then cool it so it turns back into a liquid. And then you'll eventually be left with your salt in one area and your pure water in another. So when we're looking at our different separation techniques, and you're going to do some research to find some of the common ones, you're going to use the internet to do some research on different types of separation techniques. But we need to think about what are the properties, what's the order of our different components, and what are we ultimately trying to get. So those are what you're keeping in mind when you're choosing a separation technique.